Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Diaspora History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Nina Aris, for coming on to the podcast, Diaspora History, and to speak about your article that you wrote, which I thought was it brings into context as to the genesis of slavery in the Caribbean. It's the colonial legal legacies in the diaspora and where everything from slavery to now, where that's coming from in terms of the legality, because those are things that we kind of need to look at to understand some of our own current context as to where that is coming from. So before we start with the discussion, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be on this podcast. Thank you for selecting me. So, my name is Nina Abimbola Albaros. This present moment, I am a fourth year PhD student at UC Berkeley. However, from my very telltale accent, you can probably guess I am Jamaican. I moved here for school, so very much Jamaican for the most part through and through. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. I love to have conversations like this where we think about past, present, future, not so much as a linear progression, but as a relational experience and activity. And so, we don't exist outside of context. And I think that will emerge in this conversation.
No, thank you so much for that. And, my first question is, how do you define this term historically and legally? And, why, in terms of the Black diaspora, and why is it important to frame it clearly in this discussion?
All right. Well, generally, I believe the term diaspora, it derives from Greek origins, but it refers to scattering essentially of seeds. That's a Greek origin. So we're thinking about a scattering of people. Now, I believe it's most predominantly associated with Jewish people and their scattering across the world, which is why I think it's important if we're talking about the Black diaspora or the African diaspora to name that historically and in this context also legally. We're thinking here about the movement, scattering, migration, forced migration of people of African descent living or being pushed outside of the continent. And prompt here would be the transatlantic slave trade, Middle Passage, and the subsequent creation of plantation systems, well, pre and post creations and cementing of plantation systems. So, thinking about the Black diaspora, we are invoking here an understanding of that is a byproduct or a creation of European colonization in some part, particularly if we're referring to Caribbean people, Jamaican people. If I might self-disclose a bit, I've done a bit of DNA testing, and none of my DNA hails from the Western Hemisphere. Majority is the continent of Africa, with a tiny splash of European representation, which we can guess how that got there. So, that diaspora.
With colonial laws, were they used, they were used to enforce racial hierarchy and oppression. How did legal systems actively support colonial power and economic extraction?
Well, I think first I want to show how the legal systems shaped and changed people or changed and codified people in the first place. So I spoke about the Middle Passage and the movement of people or the shifting of people across by virtue of the transatlantic slave trade. And so different nations of African people, Akan, Ashanti, Yoruba, Igbo, Mandinka, etc., became one category slave,
Mhm.
or enslaved, and needing to then work to, depending on the space that they found themselves on, needing to then work to shift or to break free of that codification, the Negro, the slave, the chattel status that came with it. So, in so doing, the codification of people, the shifting of people into categories, just like the shifting of nature into land as property, just the redefining, the recodifying, and in so doing, limiting the capabilities of people by ascribing someone the status of chattel slave that would then legally exclude them from property ownership, from voting rights, from kinship claims, and the capacity to have a family, raise that family in the way that they would desire, to control their labor, to control their land, practice religion, etc. So,
No, definitely, definitely had a huge impact. And so we'll go into, I guess, what is legal imperialism? How did colonial powers impose legal frameworks that reshaped society long after formal colonial rule had ended?
just before I answer that, I'm not sure if I responded to the piece about the economic extraction, the second piece of your
Oh,
question.
sorry. Okay,
I could, no, that's on me. So I
that's
could
okay.
just
Yeah, you
attack
can go
on
ahead and do it.
that.
I'll edit. Don't worry.
Oh, yeah, even better. So I mentioned the lack of control over persons and their bodies,
Hmm.
but to be more specific and to tie that to the economic extraction and the just the idea that racism, racial hierarchy was necessary for racial capitalism. It's been the topic that we
Hmm.
can expound on further, has been expounded on. But the mandate of working from sunrise to sunset, the planter class versus enslavement class, and the idea of extracting maximum labor, maximum profit, that has indeed, imbibed certain understandings about how we as Caribbean people now exist, and yeah, how we exist in relation to each other, how we exist in relation to the world and the global economy. So just wanted to also highlight that.
No, no, that's a good highlight. And so we'll just go back into now what is legal imperialism?
Mhm.
How did colonial powers, impose legal frameworks that reshape societies long after formal colonial rule had ended?
Right. So Scholar Smithhauser really helped me to understand legal imperialism. And if you permit me to read one
Yeah,
sentence that I really
absolutely.
loved, and I included it in the paper, says that legal imperialism universally imposed law where civil stability and order were at stake, where economic penetration, whether land tenure or modern trade, and commercial development was at issue, and most crucial, where the authority and power of the conqueror might be threatened by invocation of indigenous law. So, some of the pointers that are highlighted in that, just that one sentence about land tenure, modern trade, commercial development, threatening the authority and power through any kind of indigenous understandings or rituals. This really helped me to frame what topics I would include in this paper,
Mhm.
as it helped me to understand legal imperialism is not merely imposing laws and that's it, but really thinking about a shift in worldview, or, well, yeah, a shift in worldview that would subsequently come as a result of the imposition of these laws. So the colonizing power would have brought their legal system as a total institution upon their colonized people, which would become the worldview, as it would delegitimize the existing traditions.
Mhm.
Now, some of them dare to say that there were no existing traditions before, Europe just brought them. And some people can get away with those claims because the indigenous traditions have been so delegitimized, have been
Mhm.
so erased, have been so demonized and deemed as associated with evil or not worthy of understanding. So that total shift in understandings and way of life, which would include the legal systems within which persons operate, that shift from what existed to what the colonizer has brought in, that would be the legal imperialism. The Union Jack has been lowered for years, but some of the concepts that are associated with that version of Britain, the property law, tort law, criminal justice understandings, also deserving, undeserving, poor Elizabethan, poor laws, many of those are still imbibed within our understandings of how we should relate to each other. So, this is an example.
Absolutely, and I think we're gonna get to that in a moment. But, I mean, it just shows the I guess you can say the devaluing of a human being and defining them under law for their own use as their own power. So, what role did mercantile law play in colonial expansion? How did trade, property, and labor laws reinforce enslavement and racialized capitalism?
Thank you very much for this particular question. I really want to point out that my whole thinking about this has influenced my understanding of enslavement
Mhm.
as an economic machine. I will admit that even before grappling with the idea of mercantile law, for the most part, I was thinking, wow, enslavement, what a heinous act,
Mm.
crime against humanity, just the savagery,
Mm.
uncivilized behavior, just, really in the weeds thinking about the person to person, day to day atrocities that took place. But as I've read more David Scott, Jovan Scott Lewis, other authors, I mean, even Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, authors who describe the economic machine of enslavement, of the plantation as an economic machine that would derive currency. I mean, that is not to
Mhm.
say we should push back against thinking about enslavement also within the ideas of it being atrocious and a crime. But if we're also thinking about or situating the rationale being this is profit driven for example, England, or this is profit driven for this plantation to send the money that it needs to send. And so, with that in mind, it helped me to understand why something like this could exist for 400 years and more, and why we can see remnants still existing in other spaces of the world. Because to the people who have been affected, directly affected or otherwise, perhaps the understanding sits with, wow, this was atrocious and it shifted trajectories and destroyed lives. But one, at very least, the prevailing perspective from the colonizing force at the very least is how do we garner as much profit as possible? And so how do we turn life into profit? How do we turn animals into profit? How do we turn nature into profit? We don't think black people are humans. How do we turn them into profit? How do we turn women who can reproduce into profit? So just this idea of profit making really helps to humble my understanding of thinking through mercantile law, thinking through the rationale that will go into trade laws, into property laws,
Mhm.
into labor laws. If the understanding sits with this was atrocious and it should never happen again, it will likely happen again. If we also take into consideration that people are willing to dehumanize and people are willing to delegitimize whoever and whatever they encounter just for profit, then we can really think about how do we recognize this behavior as we see it in real time. I mentioned again people, animals, the environment being brought into a profit motive. But specifically, we can think about trade laws like navigation acts that forced countries like Jamaica, to trade exclusively with Britain, trade whether it's sugar, rum, coffee. This also mimics IMF policies that limit how countries trade and the imports that they must receive and pay for, the exports that they must send. We're also thinking about property law, which again I must stress recognize people as property. And so mortgage, insurance, debt, credit schemes, these were tied to human lives and human beings were the currency. Sure, again, they were not viewed as human beings. This was just entirely an economic profit and or economic motive. So before, when I would encounter people as property, I'm thinking, how might you see a human being and think this? But I really got humbled thinking through the role of mercantile law and understanding the dehumanization that took place that created this machine that fed into the labor laws. Maximum profit, maximum labor, minimum cost. And, further criminalizing enslaved people for any aspect of controlling their own time or any attempt
Mhm.
to push back or control their own time.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Because I mean, what you just said is just, when I was looking at, let's say, the slave registers, and you see how many hogs that they owned and what
Mm.
the value was, and just the line below it is the enslaved individual, how many were male, how many were female, how many were children, and there was an actual dollar amount associated with that. And that's
Yeah,
why planters heavily, if they got denied, even just one enslaved person, they fought that,
right, right. Orlando
right?
Patterson's book, The Sociology of Slavery, is
Mhm.
one that comes to mind that also has some breakdown figures, people and numbers. And I have to remind myself, I am saying people, and I am thinking this was heinous. But to the persons who were writing these ledgers, they were thinking of this no different from someone who walks into an insurance company
Exactly.
and says, well, I've invested and I would like my return.
Mhm. I mean, it was the prevailing investment at that time. People were making
Right.
20% return on investment. Where are you getting that now in
Ah.
2026?
Indeed.
You know, I mean, we laugh, but it's not necessarily, it just shows the point. So, looking, Nina, to the Dutch, French, and British, and Spanish, and Portuguese, and of course the American empires, what were the core legal biases embedded in their colonial legal systems?
All right, so I'll mention just a few,
Mhm.
although these can be discussed, studied extensively, and their impacts on different countries or different colonies that they had then and now can be unpacked even more. So I'll just give kind of an overview, starting with British, familiar with common law, perhaps. And this law, it influenced the Jamaican slave codes because the protections that would have been afforded to people who were considered humans then, were not afforded to people who were considered property. So that racial hierarchy, racial caste system was created and inscribed there. The French, I think, were very clear with it with Napoleonic codes. Their Code Noir,
Mhm.
officially decreeing the conditions of enslavement, that they should be brutal. And yeah, well, I will also mention, I'll also mention some of these legal codes, depending on place, also had space for manumissions, space for frameworks for, I'm hesitant to say freeing yourself because, that looked very tricky then. And religious rights,
Mhm.
which they put, they posited as necessary or important for people at the time. And these were apparently mercies, I suppose, but for the most part, reinscribing conditions of enslavement in an effort to keep the racial hierarchy and therefore continue the conditions that would boost or maximize the profit. The Spanish spaces brought in las siete partidas. This existed before. These are ideas that were, imposed upon Spanish colonies, but and offered again pathways to manumission. But for the most part, again, reinscribe conditions of slavery. And even in ideas or in spaces where manumission was possible, that would then create even tensions among some persons of color who happen to be free versus some who happen to be enslaved. And thinking about how this would affect dynamics, racial dynamics in contemporary spaces. But thinking through racist, racist as well as deeply hierarchical status is based on socioeconomics. The Dutch had their ordinances, the Roman Dutch law, or their local ordinances that they imposed. One thing I have noted, and I believe noted and put the reference in the paper, but thinking about spaces like Suriname and Curacao, the racial codes existed, but for the most part, it is noted for some reason that the the priorities for the Dutch were commercial efficiencies for their companies, so mostly profit based. Their motives behind the slave trade were entirely for profit, as opposed to also for reinscribing or for inscribing the conditions of enslavement. That's the bit I've read thus far in terms of understanding Dutch laws and how they manifested within Dutch colonies. So this is not to suggest that the same racial hierarchies, the strict and the brutal enforcement of people's delineated social orders, this is not to suggest that it didn't exist, but just that for some reason, historians tend to prioritize making a note that the Dutch West India Company was the priority for the Netherlands, and it was more their profits, perhaps in comparison, what the Portuguese, the British, the Spanish were doing on their spaces were so stark.
Yeah.
Yeah. Portuguese you mentioned, we've got, they had their racialized edicts as well, influenced by Roman law base as well. But thinking about creating their divide. So Brazil is an example of a country that or has embodied the legal system that created the stark divide between the white colonists, the enslaved Black and indigenous populations, and yeah, more, more we could say more about Brazil. I believe I mentioned about their disproportionate incarceration populations, which you know, have been linked accordingly. Just the last one, American Jim Crow, segregation, much can be said about that, much has been documented there as well. We're thinking about how that kind of segregationist perspective really influenced the American South, but also was exported into other regions close by. Similar codification of racial groups, similar totality of the state, and imposition of state law, which seem to align with racial hierarchies. So this is a bit on all those regions, but I do want to highlight that
Yes.
with
Yeah.
more.
No, absolutely. No, that's great. That's what's needed to, I guess, kind of define the slight differences between these different colonial powers. And now, Nina, we're going back to, I think you mentioned it a couple of answers ago in terms of, after emancipation, what laws were enacted that effectively maintained slavery in another form, such as you mentioned before, vagrancy laws, labor contracts, and of course, policing. That's a big one here in North America.
Right, yes. So I like to draw on scholar Jonathan Connolly here, thinking about penal contracts, vagrancy laws, and how they were noted to become increasingly repressive post slavery.
Mm.
So just for nuance, I have to highlight abolition of slavery doesn't necessarily mean abolition. Perhaps it should be more honest as a transition from
Mm,
slavery, because
mm.
there wasn't, oh, today you are free,
Yes,
today you're enslaved, tomorrow you're free. No,
exactly.
more of a transition into another version of other,
Mm,
another another type of othering with seemingly new forms of legal coercion that still manage to keep the plantation system, plantation economy running to the point where the social scientists, theorize that we still exist within the plantation economy centuries later. So thinking about so if we think about abolition of slavery, maybe we think of an off switch. But if we think about transition, then it can open us to understanding how new forms of legal acts of parliament would have created. As I mentioned before, these laws don't exist in a vacuum and they have a context within which they emerge. So vagrancy laws existed or emerged to criminalize people who seemed to be unemployed.
mm,
Does it mean you're gainfully employed and earning a wonderful wage, not even a living wage, it's like a good wage, etc.? Not necessarily, but more so within a context of the establishment of free villages, thriving free villages, then
yeah.
definitions of legality, or not legality, employment and unemployment needed to then emerge to control Black populations, formerly enslaved populations, those who attempted to leave plantations and set up free villages, or those who decided they did not want to work for white planters anymore. Those kinds of pushback against the social order. Vagrancy laws really emerged to stymie that. Also mentioned master and servant acts. So on one hand, you have vagrancy laws, which say you need to be employed. If you're not employed, you're likely going to be harassed, probably going to be harassed anyway because it's post enslavement. But then when you do have the job, the labor contract, then the conditions within which you have to work, not, of course, not unionized, of course, not protected, of course, not having the capacity to protest and have your voice be heard or to negotiate for better conditions. I mean, we have in the Caribbean in particular, we have a few holidays that venerate ancestors who post enslavement had to protest because of the harsh living conditions that mimicked slavery. And the response of the colonial powers was to suppress them by murder. So, thinking about how these master and servant kind of acts made it a criminal offense, not even just, okay, this is a civil issue between two people for a laborer to leave their job. I'm using job and labor very loosely here,
Yeah.
but a criminal offense, a breach of contract. And again, if a human, you're not human, you're a property. So you breach the contract by not working in the way that this white planter with immensely more status as a human, you know, who can impose, they can re-imprison you and re-enslave you for attempting to exercise your own freedom. So it's a sticky situation regardless. And
Mhm.
just to say a bit about policing, I mean, I so, so much has been documented, which grateful for, which analyzes states, which analyzes or which critiques the total power that states assume over people, over with particularly pertaining to extrajudicial killings, over surveillance, etc. So there's more content to draw from, more scholarly content to glean in terms of understanding the trajectory of policing, especially if we're looking at people within Black geographies, the ideas of old slave patrols shifting towards, you know, sheriff kind of
Mhm.
police enforcing laws that control how people move across place and space and the boundaries within which they can move and the time within which they can move, tracking down people who have deserted, quote unquote, spaces that they should not be. And just thinking about how, at the very least, at the onset, these policing initiatives were not to protect the general public unless you exclude the Black population from the general public and, also align with the eugenics ideas that Black people aren't human and don't deserve these kinds of protections. And so, with this in mind, it's not very difficult for me to understand how countries within the Caribbean can still have extradite. Well, I'm saying within the Caribbean, I'm in the US, same thing in terms of brutal policing being exposed, extrajudicial killings, high extrajudicial killings. Jamaica features prominently in the news pertaining to that. So, just thinking about how these measures and the ways in which we understand
Mm,
how people are supposed to move, as well
mhm.
as the ways in which we still relate to people, even if the word slave and the title slave was abolished, how we still relate to people who we deem to be landless, rightsless, unworthy of moving in the ways they want to move, and, how we think about how labor should be controlled.
No, thank you for that because it does have a basis of where it's coming from, and we just need to recognize and kind of be aware of that. So, how did colonial legal systems, again, you talked about it in terms of limiting land ownership for African, of course, indigenous peoples, and what long-term impacts does this disposition still have today?
Gosh, yes, limiting is, I think, such a euphemism
Yeah.
for what really took place here. I mean, again, I must start at pre-colonization.
Mhm,
We're not certain. We assume land was relational.
mm,
Based on what I've read, land was relational to the indigenous people who occupied the North, South American, Caribbean spaces. Land as relational, not land as ownership.
mhm,
Person as steward to land, not land as property to be passed down to select people within the family, kind of thing. Post colonization, or at the very least post European contact, and the legal imperialism that came with their worldview, nature and the sea and trees, etc., aspects of nature, animals therein became land.
mhm,
Land became tied to economic independence. So, since I didn't want Black people to have economic independence, of course, Black people would not be able to own land, and neither would the indigenous people who they didn't manage to completely wipe out from the space. But with land being the key to economic independence, according to the worldview that was brought by European colonization, which did not seem to exist before. You didn't need land for economic independence in the manner of ownership. You needed to be a steward. You needed to plant and respect the land, and the land would treat you well, perhaps. But with this understanding of land being tied to economic independence, again, you can understand why colonial and post-colonial systems would exclude Black people then from owning land, and even worse, becoming majority owners and holders of land. So after emancipation, you'd see planters still keeping rents high on estate land in an effort to force the people who they knew were not able to work for much to keep, imbibed within wage slavery, to keep collecting very low salaries and
mhm,
under constrained working conditions, if, being compensated at all. Yet, I have to mention our ancestors pooled resources and bought land, collectively still managed to have the ethic of communal land ownership
mhm,
tied to freedom. So creating free villages. We're talking about Jamaica like Sligoville, Augustine, etc. Free spaces that could stand as a land-based assertion
mhm,
of their own freedom that they did not need to fight amongst each other to pick out one specific owner or dominant person and then have the rest working, being disproportionately compensated in order to have that one in the free village. And if we think about a free village, that's not the composition there. Unfortunately, the the state, which was representative of the colonial force, the crown, at the time, if we're talking about, again, Jamaica, Segoville, or free villages within Jamaica, although free villages within the Caribbean have similar stories. You know, police would come in, crown, it would be deemed crown lands and therefore sold off. At different points in time, people would be displaced, and you have no title, no legal representation. The system's mortgage credit would be for the benefit of planters, not people who are trying to free themselves and remain free or disassociate themselves from plantation life completely. And so, because those banking and credit systems were designed for the planters, not for small farmers, it would be very difficult for them to remain in a free village and, have that trajectory of freedom continuing without participating in the exploitative system.
Mhm.
And then now we live in the afterlives. So creating continuously creating landless and near landless peasantry dependent on plantation labor. That those were the seeds that were sowed then. And now, because we need to have a person with a land title, where a family could have rationalized, or even a community, but let
Mhm.
me say family,
Yeah.
could have rationalized sharing land in a non-legal communal way. Now, a dispute would need to emerge over who needs to be what owner, what needs to happen.
Mhm.
Their concentrations of land ownership is still tied to economic independence because the worldview has not shifted generally. And so now we find these lands moving into corporate hands when it's not crown hands. And so maybe it's for bauxite mining, maybe it's for tourism, maybe it's for agriculture or real estate development
Yes.
that is not going to benefit the country in terms of its majority profit
Mhm.
making. So still thinking about, again, we're going back to that legal imperialism and where I thought it was important to name that before European contact, perhaps what existed within this space, would have been a communal
Mhm.
understanding and a shared episteme about relationality with land. But, we operate within this context where the owner can do what they wish without consulting the nearby community. If they wish to have here be mined or gentrified or left alone.
Mhm.
I must also mention urbanization, where cities are created in spaces. People who are seeking economic freedoms will largely go there. You don't even need to be forced to go into a city and then live within the confines and the restraints in order to achieve or leverage some level of economic freedom. And with that also, what is deemed or has been considered, I think, dehumanizingly so, squatting.
Mhm.
uh, I mean, I have serious qualms with that term. I think it's ridiculous and insidious for persons who were forced on a land and enslaved on a land to be then rendered landless, while persons who were not and persons who were instrumental or their ancestors instrumental in this can still own such land. I think that conundrum is just preposterous and very much in service of the same colonial legal system I've been talking about.
Mhm.
But the constant threat of eviction and the needing to live in spaces that are environmentally compromised, climate at risk of issues due to climate change and so on. Not the most arable, not the most desirable spaces, just, you know, where can you go and put somewhere temporary? That kind of displacement within a space that has already, you know, lived through colonization, enslavement, post colonization, as is asserted now, you know, to not be able to break loose, to not be able to free oneself or one's population from this idea of landlessness, it indicates that perhaps we're still tentacled. You know, we haven't necessarily severed some ties, even if we want to think that we have, because economic subjugation is still part and parcel to the subjugation that's necessary here.
No, that's still very much, I would say, active in my opinion, in terms of how that, especially when it comes to land and the association to it. Now, we'll go into the capital punishment. How was capital punishment used within colonial legal systems? What were its two primary impacts, especially on Black and Indigenous communities?
Okay, so here I lean on scholar Stacey Hind,
Mhm,
and when I'm thinking about the two primary impacts, and I believe they existed. They emerged then. They're still very much in existence now. Still very much, yeah, still very much emergent and manifesting now. One would be capital punishment as an instrument of terror
mhm,
or fear.
mhm,
So thinking about the spectacle of capital punishment through a public execution. Like I keep drawing on Jamaica,
mhm,
cause Jamaican. So when we say yes, no, Spanish Town, the gallows of Spanish Town. Not, as a child, I was singing that, even though this was long, apparently, something long deemed in the past that
mhm,
should be getting over. But that's just instrument of deterrent that became a children's song. The public execution in an effort to display who has absolute power
mhm,
and who needs to know their place. And I believe now when some gangs, some groups, also police, but not necessarily just police, but when these kind of public executions are done, whether it's within communities or perhaps you're scrolling on social media and seeing something that's very public that has happened, just the understanding that this is meant to instill fear, to demonstrate who has power, to remind people what is at stake and what will happen for breaking the rules. Now, the rules vary within the context of capital punishment as a tool for racial terror.
mhm,
Within colonization, the offenses would be, you know, to the tune of damaging property, including people, offending white people, and offending can mean so many things, usually hitting, hurting, etc. But I mean, these charges could be easily trumped up within a space where people do not have power within the first place. But acts that challenge the racial order and the racial hierarchy and the imbibed socio-political structure that was created as a result of this colonial network, particularly if they were done. I do also want to mention, particularly if they were done by Black people, Indigenous people, but also the select white people who put themselves forward and said, no, this is not fair, also executed. So, instrument of terror, instrument of deterrence to have everyone know their place and know that challenges to the social order were not to occur. That would be one. And then the second would be as a tool that suppresses resistance. So if you're thinking about, I mentioned before how we can hold with pride some of they call them rebellions because you're rebelling against the social order. England was correct. How could you hurt their feelings and rebel? So, so it's a rebellion.
mhm,
But that it depends on whose perspective you're really coming from with these terms. I don't deem this to be anything but natural, natural, or of course you must have a revolution against, the people who are suppressing you, especially suppressing you in these very, very heinous ways. Now, in response, of course, because they had absolutely no space for any kind of rebellion against their social order, the law was used then through capital punishment to execute leaders of resistance, people who were apparently caught for sowing seeds of discord or yeah, actively known to be active in rebellions. So some of our national heroes, if you think about the Morant Bay Rebellion, or the Montego Bay, So some of our national heroes I mentioned, like Paul Bogle, Samuel Sharp, etc., executed because of, deemed to be criminals for the revolution that they would have organized. And yeah, yeah. So suppressing resistance in an
Mhm.
effort to crush any political aspirations that Black people would have had about Black supremacy, pushing away the white supremacy that was forcing itself. And this is also, particularly tricky in spaces where you have real Black majorities within the countries. The capital punishment as a tool for suppressing resistance, they would need buy-in not only from white populations, also very much from Black populations, that this is necessary for maintaining social order.
Mhm. Absolutely, and I'm pretty sure those Black populations were part of, I would say, the upper echelon, so to speak, to
Indeed.
maintain, right? So now,
Indeed.
Nina, we're going to go to a part where we're going to be talking about, the African spiritual practices, and of course, how were they legally suppressed? Are there laws, either historical or current, that continue to restrict these religious expressions?
Oh yeah, totally. And again, in the interest of timing and so on, I'll just do brief mentions. But I want to signpost another scholar who I really like to follow. She's Trinidadian by the name of Tracy Hooks, who brings this conversation further. But it's a conversation that's
Mhm.
been had across the Caribbean about the different ways in which African syncretic religions, beliefs, ideas, practices have been suppressed, and different reasons for why they've been suppressed, which range from just their very existence, delegitimizing and challenging the European social order, to, wow, perhaps these were actually quite effective at stymieing or at strengthening resistance movements, and in so doing, really posed a threat to the European social order. But regardless, laws emerged, and in countries like Jamaica still exist. Every now and again, there is some charged debate about whether or not this should happen. Missing from the charge debate is how the context within which these laws arose in the first place. And I think that might lend to people's understandings and perspective about this. If you've only been taught, okay, here is something that is evil that your ancestors did, but your ancestors are evil. What they did is evil, and you're born in evil.
Mm,
So, just believe that, and that's it. Sure, okay, then maybe this makes sense. But if you're going further, thinking about whose legal imperialism have we been, you know, have we had to succumb to? And whose epistemologies are we ascribing to? Then we can think about, why is it that some mythologies are deemed to be sacred and other mythologies are deemed to be profane?
mhm,
Now, thinking about efforts to suppress Obia, Mayal, and those other African derived practices criminalized during slavery and colonization, considered to be severe offenses. But I cannot ignore the anti Black fixation that exists there, and the ascribing to evil, the ascribing to savagery. These are anti Black sentiments, that your ancestors could only come up with something that is evil.
Mhm.
The mint tea that your grandmother told you to drink for your headache, that's evil, you know? And when your cousin dreamt that she saw a fish and you're pregnant, that's evil, you know?
Mhm.
These ideas, these notions, are indicators of black savagery
Yeah.
with legal bases that resulted in whippings, floggings, imprisonment of for people who were known to practice or consult. So sure, we can say maybe now at within different ranges, these are not necessarily enforced in the way that they would have been enforced then. But at the
Mhm.
same time, just the conversation that has mental reinforcement, the aligning with the very racist colonial laws and policies that prefer and put forward European beliefs and understandings and traditions as good and as unquestionable, even if they were the ones that your enslavers held onto, while the ones that you would have brought, across the continent while you were forced under extreme conditions of extreme depravity. I mean, there aren't even one or two just descriptors for just how terrible the kidnapping, the transportation, and the enslavement and subsequent just, all of those. The idea that
Mhm.
there's no state sanctioned delegitimizing of African cosmologies is sad on so many levels. The
Mhm.
privileging of European derived Christianity is not apolitical. It's not neutral. It's not, oh well, you would have found the right religion anyway, and this is just how it happened. These are the results of deliberate acts.
Mhm.
So just like the law is not a neutral arbiter, these religions and the way we see these religions and beliefs and practices are also not neutral.
Mhm.
Now, this isn't necessarily one of African spirituality per se, but I do also want to mention Rastafari
Mhm.
and its treatment. I want to
Mhm.
highlight Alexander Bustamante, whose given name was William Clark, noted to be a national hero in Jamaica. I have serious pushback against that,
Yeah.
just because of his role in the Coral Gardens
Yeah.
atrocity that took place,
Mhm.
but very much the understanding that Black people could decide, you know what, you talk about a king and a queen, I'm going to look to the east
Yes.
and honor that one.
Exactly.
And you know what, I'm going to challenge what you are saying, even with the language that you have imposed,
Mhm.
will change this conversation and how that resulted in the suppression of people of Rastafari groups and the state sanctioned beating and killing of Rastafari people by again William Clark, aka Bustamante, who I mentioned. Just, we would look at these things differently if it is that we remove s- this notion that European colonization was the best thing
Mhm.
for the Caribbean and also the best thing for enslaved populations who were dragged into the Caribbean. Then we begin to see some of these.
Yes.
Differently.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I think you made it that connection in terms of the fact of decreasing one in order for another to rise, and there was a reason behind that, right? Because it wasn't just one religion coming in, it was many coming in to suppress and to say, yes, we can use this population to advance us. So, no, and then of course, there's just so many, but we won't go into that at the moment. But Nina, I just wanted to, then go into, of course, the what are the enduring legal impacts of
Uh,
colonial era capital punishment and criminalization laws in contemporary justice systems.
right. So, I mean, one thing it has done, it has s- desensitized us from the spectacle of Black violence and just violence as a whole. So, when we look at some of the when we grapple with the high rates of incarceration or the manner in which punitiveness is doled out. Sometimes it's a very easy and knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, well, we don't need to think about rehabilitation or restorative justice in this context. The person probably deserved it. They should have cooperated, etc. There are so many knee-jerk, victim-blaming ideas that we can put forward. But again, if we remove some of the privileging of European worldviews or the ways in which they wanted us to view ourselves, then maybe we look at the Caribbean having high incarceration rates very differently, particularly because of the geographies that exist within the Caribbean. And I
Mm-hmm.
also mentioned Brazil as well. This colonial emphasis on punishment for deterrence, which ironically a few colonial states, former colonial states, have moved from and shifted away from, whereas restorative justice and rehabilitation may exist, but in weaker forms in within spaces and not necessarily as endorsed forms within the Caribbean, more so leaning towards high incarceration rates and then the conditions when one enters the carceral system becomes, another problem to unpack.
Yes.
As I dare say, rehabilitation doesn't exist there as much as imbibing one within criminal networks would exist, as well as just dehumanizing conditions,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which, if we think about, okay, when was this space built? What was it originally used for? Then maybe we see certain parallels with enslavement and how people were treated. So there's a kind of appetite for punitiveness. Also thinking about the retention of the death penalty, which some spaces do retain.
Mm-hmm.
Even for the spaces that don't, I still raise an eyebrow. Looking at Jamaica, which claims that, it has not enforced the death penalty in a few years. Fine. However, let me say a decade or so. Let me be generous. Fine. But when we think about how Jamaica features prominently in the news for extrajudicial killings, murders by the police, I'll get to policing soon, but just thinking about that, have we really removed the capital punishment or have we removed the trial from the capital
Yeah.
punishment? Have we just removed that piece?
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about that, another obvious one is retaining the Privy Council as the final appellate court, which is hotly debated because, again, persons, it doesn't indicate independence. At the same time, are persons quick to trust the remnants of coloniality which exists within parliaments today?
Mm-hmm.
Then also thinking about the legacies of policing and the legacies of criminalization that exists, and particularly the relationship of police. I can shift from Caribbean and move into American spaces just
Mm-hmm.
to highlight the conversation about the over surveillance, just in case persons can't necessarily relate, or I think it's fine or necessary.
That's
But
right.
American studies and conversations about just the over surveillance and over policing and the use of brute force, the criminalization of poverty, the use of brute force when persons have mental health crises and need assistance, laws, and enforcement of laws of movement and
Mm-hmm.
loitering, and again, vagrancy. These things are still prominent. If we pull them into the Caribbean spaces, they exist as well. Some people, depending on socioeconomic status, might be able to avoid a checkpoint or two or a few kinds of harassment. Or
Yeah.
maybe if it happens to them, they have some recourse.
Yes. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is not the experience of,
Oh.
any people or people I've come across or know, that's not the predominant experience. And this feeds sentiments that the remnants of policing and the death penalty, the punitiveness, these things really serve the agenda of sustaining the elite and their hold to land and hold to legitimacy
Mm-hmm.
and continuing to reinscribe meager wages as, equitable and fair. I call it wage slavery, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. No,
harsh.
absolutely. No, that's very true. That's why people end up having to work 2 and 3 jobs
Right.
to be able to survive, and it's
Right.
not a good thing. But, Nina, as we come to a close with this particular discussion, what would you like listeners to take away from these colonial legal legacies in the Black diaspora?
I think firstly, that this is a nuanced conversation, just in case it has not been introduced as such. In case this conversation has been introduced, or the way in which we navigate the world has been introduced as this is just how the way things are, and structural forces are not at play or at work, historical and contemporary, that have long inscribed relationships. And if we remove that kind of thinking and are a bit more critical about the world we see and live within, then maybe we can see more about where colonization still exists within our world. And so when we hear the term decolonization, which is thrown around very often, whether in literature, social media, etc., we can remove it from just being, as Tokanyang said, a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. So thinking about fundamental decolonization, if it's decolonization of law, really stepping back, ensuring that we're not still thinking with that worldview, that legal imperialist worldview, when we're approaching these systems. I do think it's important to amplify some of the works of like some of the people I mentioned who have influenced my thinking here. I think it's important to amplify their work as they push back against what many states, and therefore education systems representative of the states, will likely encourage people to learn and to know and to document. And in so doing, perhaps we can then begin to develop Caribbean legal theory and practice, if that is what we decide to do and want to do. But we can't get away from the legacies of enslavement and indentureship in how we understand our legal systems,
Mhm.
today. And then especially if somebody is in the position of policy making, are able to do certain kinds of legislative audits to highlight and identify some of the codes that we have that have racist origins, and then prioritize restorative justice programs and community-based programs, social support systems that address and push back against some of the very natural occurrences of neoliberalism, the crimes, the uh, discrepancies within equitability according to land, etc. So
No, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this subject. I know it can be kind of charged for some of the topics, but it's only until we look at things and we start discussing things that we can move forward kind of in a different, I like to call kind of a different framework to be able to how we can change certain things. So I appreciate your time for coming on to the podcast. Thank you.
thank you very much for your time and for engaging with me, and us having this dialogue.
Mm, absolutely. Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.